All right, welcome to Module 2 of this course. The first module was talking about um, basically the history of psychology before psychology became a science. Now with Module 2, we're going to be talking about the very first psychologists who were at least purporting to be scientific. You'll see that that line between scientific and not scientific can be a little blurry, but we're definitely getting there at this juncture. And I'm going to see if I can get through all of this in one part. I might need to take a break and do a part two. We'll see. So to start off, like I said in Module 1, there were many influential thinkers who thought there could never be a science of the mind. And their arguments were basically based on the assumption that you can't observe the mind. The mind can't observe itself, and you can't directly observe the minds of others. So if you can't have empirical observation, then how can you have a science? And let's see. And also, there seems to be no basis on which to make laws. A science establishes laws. There are laws in physics and laws in chemistry. How could you have laws in psychology? It seems like there's too much free will, too much randomness, uh, just not the kind of thing that's amenable to real rigorous scientific scrutiny. So this was kind of the lines that Immanuel Kant argued. Auguste Comte argued that, and even our buddy here, Galileo, said that there could never be a science of the mind. So that's part of this chapter, is to take their questions seriously and say, well, did psychology ever become a science? If it did, was it by the criteria these guys were setting, or does it kind of have its own criteria? And also, this chapter is, I talked not too much about clinical psychology in the first module. I did talk about the humoral theory. We're going to start talking more about asylums and technological innovations, quote unquote innovations, meant to address mental health. We're going to start talking about that a little more in this chapter, or this module, but I don't think we really get into that until module 3, although some of that stuff is going on at this time. Um, Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what does it actually mean, empirical observation. Um, Obviously, that's kind of a necessary ingredient for something to be considered a science, but it's not a sufficient ingredient. So, astrology, alchemy, they involved empirical observation, but we wouldn't say that astrology or alchemy are really scientific. And plus, empirical observation has to be driven by theory. You can't just accumulate useless factoids and call that science. There has to be attempts at systematizing, theorizing, finding commonalities. You can't just show me a bunch of facts, even if they're facts that are related to some similar topics. It's it's not a science if it's just a bunch of facts, you know? So you have to have empirical verification and you have to have theory to some extent. And in this module, we're going to see plenty of cures and treatments that were based on empirical observation, especially in the next module. But keep in mind that merely having empirical observation doesn't make something scientific. And in general, you should think carefully about what does it mean to have a good theory in the context of behavioral science generally, or psychology specifically. A good theory should not just be something you confirm with empirical evidence. It should be supported by empirical evidence, but it's you don't want to just look for evidence that supports your theory. We want to actually test the theories, put them to a fair test. Let's also talk more about this what makes something science, what makes something not science. This is called the demarcation problem in philosophy of science. The demarcation problem is the problem of trying to figure out what makes science science and what makes non-science non-science. There's also this thing called pseudoscience. You have probably encountered pseudoscience at some point in your life. If you've ever watched Dr. Oz or Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Factory or whatever on Netflix, or if you've ever been to that part of the store, every grocery store has a few aisles where they have supplements, supplements that are not regulated by the FDA and oftentimes don't even have the ingredients they claim to have, at least not even in the dosages or meeting purity standards whatsoever. And in general, a pseudoscience is something that wants to be taken seriously as a science. It wants to be given the benefit of the doubt and the respect of science, but it isn't actually meeting the standards of science. And it can be very important to examine cases of pseudoscience, such as crystal healing, coffee enemas, mushroom tea, I guess. I've never looked into mushroom tea. Dolphin therapy. I mean, keep an open mind. You might hear an outrageous idea, or you might hear an idea that doesn't sound so outrageous. But we want to ask, what criteria and standards have to be met for some therapy or device or treatment or theory to really be considered scientific as opposed to pseudoscientific? Yeah. If you're going to be a psychologist, you don't want to be collecting people's money and billing insurance if you're not doing something that's really scientific or supported by real evidence. That would make you a fraudster, wouldn't it? So, one important thing to keep in mind when you're asking questions about is something a scientific theory or is a treatment science based is to ask yourself whether it is falsifiable. Karl Popper, right here, Austrian philosopher of science, came up with this falsifiability criterion. It is a requirement for something to be science-based or scientific, but it is not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. Merely being falsifiable does not mean it's scientific. This is just kind of a minimum. You have to at least be falsifiable to even still be considered, to even still be under consideration to potentially maybe be scientific. This is a way of ruling things out. If it's not falsifiable, you can rule it out. So what does it mean to be falsifiable? That means that it can be proven or it can be shown to be wrong. That doesn't mean it is wrong. That means that there is some observation that in principle could be made and could show that a theory is wrong. Now, it can be really hard to come up with a study that will conclusively verify, support, or falsify a theory. It's actually really easy to find support for a theory because theories tend to be good at explaining things. What's a problem is when a theory is too good at explaining things. If it explains everything, no matter what observation you can make, then maybe it's not such a good theory. But it can be really hard to falsify a theory because there's something called auxiliary assumptions. So if you have a way of looking at things, like if you're a psychoanalyst like Freud, or if you're a Marxist like Marx, then if there's some pattern of behavior that doesn't fit with your psychoanalytic theory, or if there's some economic trends or historical trends that don't fit with your Marxist theory, then you could always argue and say, well, there are these certain assumptions I made. If you jettison those assumptions, then my theory still holds. But in general, I think Popper's falsifiability criterion is a good thing to keep in mind. If you have a theory that's so good at explaining everything that there's just no bit of observation or evidence that could even count against it, then it's probably too good to be true. So let's skip that. Let's take a simple example. All men are pigs. This is a toy example. But, some people might think, well, all men are pigs deep down. No matter how they might seem to be acting, there's ultimately some nasty reason men are doing what they want to do. This is a kind of a theory, and depending on how stubborn the theorist is, they might prove that their theory is unfalsifiable if, for example, you say, well, I know a man who's very generous. He gives anonymous donations and he volunteers his time, and he doesn't seem to brag about it. I didn't even know he volunteered his time. He doesn't tell his friends about it. He just does all these generous things and doesn't seem to get anything out of it. Those observations would seem to falsify the general statement, all men are pigs. But if you're stubborn and you are creating an unfalsifiable version of the theory that all men are pigs, then you can always say, well, that man you just named might seem like he's not a pig, but actually he's really getting off on feeling like all these people owe him one, and he loves feeling superior, like other people need me. So it's unfalsifiable because you can kind of twist all the facts to still fit your theory. No matter how much evidence mounts against the theory, you'll find a way for your theory to be untrue, to still be true. So it's unfalsifiable. Here's another example, a more realistic one: young Earth creationism. Creationism by itself, without the young Earth part, is just the idea that humanity was created. How exactly they were created and how long ago is often left unspecified or doesn't need to be specified. Different people believe different things. But young Earth creationism is a specific strand of creationism which says that humanity was created at the same time the Earth was, and this was about 5,000 years old, or 5,000 years ago. So if you meet a young Earth creationist and they have a falsifiable version of this theory, then you can say, well, I mean, do you agree or disagree with the principles underlying carbon dating and other dating techniques? Do you know that molecules have constant rates at which they approach half-life and whatnot? Do you disagree with these basic chemical laws? They might say yes, they might say no. If they don't say they disagree, then you can say, well, then we have plenty of evidence that a lot of things are older than 5,000 years old, not to mention all the dinosaur bones and fossils and whatnot. It seems to contradict the theory that the Earth has only been around for 5,000 years. If you want to be unfalsifiable about your young Earth creationist theory, then you could deny that carbon dating is real. You could say, well, actually, God created these fossils to test your faith, and he created half-life rates with chemical reactions. He did all that so that it would all appear as if it's much older than 5,000 years to test your faith. So this theory is too stubborn to be falsified. It is unfalsifiable. So if someone was advancing young Earth creationism as a serious scientific theory, they would fail the falsifiability test. It's not scientific. It's perfectly fine if you still want to believe this, but according to Popper, and I think this is a good criterion, to be considered a legitimate empirical scientific theory, it has to at least be falsifiable. Now, is Freudian psychoanalysis scientific? Now we're getting spicy. So you remember the reaction formation, maybe, from Psych 101? This is when certain behaviors or the ideas of doing certain things gives you lots of anxiety. So let's say there's a man who is a latent homosexual, and it causes him anxiety to think about coming out, even to himself. And so to combat this anxiety, he becomes very promiscuous to kind of reduce that anxiety, to kind of try and prove to himself, no, I'm not gay. I'm super straight. This would be a textbook example of reaction formation as psychoanalytic theory defines reaction formation. But is this a real thing that happens? Suppose you meet a man that's very promiscuous with women. Does that mean that that's reaction formation? That means that he must be a latent homosexual? Um, well, it's go gather some more observations. You interview the guy. Maybe you could do some sneaky, this is getting weird. You could do some sneaky physiological measurements to see how aroused he becomes at certain images. I don't know. If you go gather a bunch of facts and try and test, is this person deep down actually gay and he's only acting quote unquote super straight as a way of easing his anxiety about being gay? A Freudian could potentially be unfalsifiable about this and refuse to accept any explanation you could give. They could always say, well, the reason that he doesn't show any signs of being gay, apart from me just saying he is because that's how anxious it makes him. He's doing all these other things to try and make it look like there's just absolutely no way. That's basically what this quote is saying. So, in summation, if a theory explains everything you can possibly observe, even if these observations should falsify the theory, then the theory isn't really explaining anything after all, right? If you claim to be able to explain everything, even if empirical observation really runs against the grain of your theory, then your theory is probably no good, according to Popper's criterion. So that's falsifiability. As you navigate the world of psychology and eventually become some sort of practitioner who incorporates psychological knowledge, findings from psychology, keep in mind, is the theoretical framework they're working with, is this something that could be falsified? If it's the kind of framework that has an explanation for everything and will stubbornly explain away phenomena that seem to run against the grain of the theory, then you might be in danger. But anyway, back to the history. So, one of the earliest forms of, I guess you can call it, it's a bit like personality testing, it's a bit like intelligence testing. It's a type of pseudoscientific early attempt at scientific psychology. It's called phrenology. Phrenology was founded in the early 1800s by Francis Gall, and it's this idea that, look, the brain is going to be shaped differently and have different physiological characteristics that correspond to different traits, such as higher intelligence, lower morals, a greater sense of humor, a greater proclivity towards becoming depressed. The brain's shape should reflect these traits, and since the skull surrounds the brain, the skull should therefore show some shapes that correspond to these different traits. Boy, does it seem like a leap in retrospect, but this was the early 1800s. Biology, physiology, psychology were just getting started as sciences, and please try to remember that hindsight is 2020. And if you think this stuff seems outrageous, try to just appreciate how far we've come and reflect upon the mistakes people made in the past and try to look at the mistakes we might be making in the present. Anyway, Gall studied people's skulls, he studied the bumps, and he claimed that these different bumps indeed correlated with different traits. Now, you might have noticed that Gall himself has a pretty oddly shaped head. He's got this very big, round frontal area in his skull. Cartoonists at the time didn't fail to notice this, that the guy with the kind of oddly shaped skull was obsessed with other people's skulls. Very strange. Of course, the biological facts don't really line up with phrenology. The skull does not have a one-to-one topology with the brain. You can have a skull, the geometry of your skull, scalp, and hair does not really necessarily align at all with the sulci and gyri of your brain. And even if it did, it's a leap, even in theory, that the brain would have these one-to-one connections to something that we verbally describe as more moral sentiments and proclivity towards depression. Modern neuroscience has found that there are some processes in the brain that have to do with neurotransmitter regulation that underlies a tendency towards depression. There are some brain areas that do specialize in certain tasks. There is some evidence that there could be a correlation between volume of certain areas in the brain with certain abilities, but finding it in the skull is just a bridge too far. And because they didn't really gather systematic data, they didn't have objective tests and validated tests. It was just kind of doomed to fail from the start. But the public ate phrenology up. Phrenology was huge. Go and get your skull read was a considered to be a serious endeavor. Academia took phrenology seriously. Fun fact: Mark Twain, who hopefully you read at some point in K through 12, Tom Sawyer, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, wrote a lot of great American classics. Well, Mark Twain was considered a pretty funny guy back in the 1800s, and he went to go see a phrenologist named Fowler, and Twain got his skull read. Fowler had no idea who this was. He just rubbed his fingers across Twain's skull, and he ended up giving him a breakdown of what his personality traits were like, and he said, "You have no sense of humor based on your skull." Well, Twain came back 3 months later, and this time he said, "Hi, I'm Mark Twain, writer of the Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn books." And Fowler apparently didn't remember meeting Twain already, but he did remember the name, Mark Twain. And of course, Mark Twain's known as this comedic, sarcastic writer, and Fowler rereads Twain's skull and says, "Ah, yes, I can see right here, this bump right here means you're very funny. You have a great sense of humor." So yeah, big blaring sign of pseudoscience is when your measurements are not reliable. This Mark Twain example is a great example of that, and don't think that we're perfectly reliable with our measurement instruments today. Now, on the topic of psychology as a science, you might recall that one of the arguments was that you could never have laws in psychology the way that you have laws in chemistry and physics and arguably maybe biology. I consider biology to be a pretty good example of a science, although I don't know if you'd really say it has laws in the same sense as physics or chemistry. But even today, when you look at psychology, do you see any laws of human behavior? No. At best, you see highly replicable statistical regularities, right? But those are far from being laws. What's interesting is that there was a brief but still kind of enduring, but kind of a self-contained episode. There are still psychophysicists around today. They're just not very common. But there was this episode in the history of psychology called psychophysics. Psychophysics was a big deal at the time, and it got a lot of the early physiologists and philosophers who were working at the time, got them excited by the prospect of psychology becoming a real legit science and got them working on it. And psychophysics as a system of research kind of played itself out and seemed to kind of get as far as it could get. But, the reason I stop and talk about it is to highlight the fact that maybe there can be laws in psychology, but also because this is just an important chapter. It was very influential, this chapter in the history of psychology. So what is psychophysics? Psychophysics is the mathematical relationship, or creating mathematical relationships between mental events and physical events. So Physical stuff you can observe and measure would be an intensity of light, a electrical pulse going through a wire, weight, height. These are physical quantities that can be measured and quantified. It's the kind of thing that physicists and chemists can make mathematical laws regarding. They can make laws regarding these phenomena because these phenomena are very precisely measurable and therefore amenable to mathematical equation crunching. And this is exactly what Galileo and Kant said could not be done. They said you can't do this with mental stuff. Well, the psychophysicist said, actually, yes, you can. We can map mental phenomena like judgments and decisions to physical stimuli like light levels and pitch levels, and we can use mathematical laws to do so. So the very first psychophysicist was Max Weber. He was a physiologist by training. A lot of the very earliest psychologists were physiologists who were venturing out into not just describing the tissues and the systems, but to look at the organism's behavior as a whole. And so something Weber did on the side was he would do things like the 2-point threshold. What's the 2-point threshold? So let's say I take a pin and I prick a part of your back near your right shoulder blade, and then I move my pin a half an inch down and prick the same spot but a half an inch down. To you, it might not be clear whether I pricked the same spot or whether I pricked a different spot. Different parts of your body have different 2-point thresholds. The distance between one pinprick and another has to be larger for insensitive parts of your body. It has a large 2-point threshold. And other parts of your body are very sensitive. If I have 2 pinpricks that are half an inch apart, you can very easily tell that they were, very close together. I'd say your fingertips are good examples. You probably couldn't tell, like if I went to like parts of your lower middle back area and did the pinprick, it'd probably be really hard to tell if I hit the same spot twice or if I moved my pin slightly. But if I did that to your fingertips, and of course you'd be blindfolded, you'd probably be able to easily tell if I took the same distance and went over there. And Weber took this 2-point threshold idea and he mathematized it and showed that there are some, general mathematical laws that hold up. And what's a bigger deal, and this is kind of related, is his work on just noticeable differences, or JNDs. A just noticeable difference is exactly what it sounds like. If I give you 2 stimuli, you try to tell me, is this the same stimulus or is this a different stimulus? So if I blindfold you and I hand you 2 weights, I hand you one, you kind of feel how heavy it is. I take it back, I hand you another one, you feel how heavy it is. I ask you, are they the same weight or are they a different weight? Or light levels. I put you in a dark room, complete pitch black, and then I turn on a light, turn it off, turn it on again, turn it off, and I say, okay, I got 2 flashes of light. Were they the same light levels or were they different light levels? In each case, when you're comparing stimuli, you can look for a just noticeable difference. How different do 2 weights have to be before you can notice that they're different? What's the slightest difference that has to be found between 2 weights before you can notice that they're different? Or with light levels, you measure light. I forget the unit that light's measured in. Lumens? I don't know. How big does a difference in light have to be before you can tell, that second light was brighter or dimmer than the standard light that I was comparing it to? These are all just noticeable differences. And you can apply this to all kinds of different perceptions and sensations, where you're comparing light levels visually, or if you're comparing weight levels with your sense of touch, or I guess that technically wouldn't be touch, it'd be some sort of bodily balance thing. But what's interesting is when you look for just noticeable differences, the the difference that has to be there between the standard stimulus and the comparison stimulus, the difference that has to be found between them in order for you to just notice is a constant fraction. So, for instance, let's say that constant fraction is 14%. If I give you let's say a 100 gram, I don't know if that would even be the right unit to use, but if I give you a 100 gram weight as the standard weight, I ask you to feel how much it weighs. Then I take it away, I give you another one, and it's 114 grams. That would be exactly 14% heavier. And let's just say that's the threshold of just noticeable difference. What Weber found was that this fraction, this constant fraction, is everywhere. The just noticeable difference for all kinds of things was true across the board. So there was this basically a law of perception, Weber's law. You hear that, Kant? You hear that, Galileo? A law, thank you very much. There is a law mapping measurable physical stimuli like weight, light levels, to mental events, a just noticeable difference. And a just noticeable difference really just amounts to someone saying, I think this weight is heavier, or no, I think the two weights were the same. So it is still observable, and there is a mathematical equation that links the two in a law-like way. It is a quantitative law in psychology. This got everyone excited. Everyone thought, wow, psychology actually can be a science. And spoiler alert, psychophysics kind of didn't become that big of a deal. It's still a field of psychology, and there's still people doing work, and they probably wouldn't like me acting like it's not that big of a deal anymore. But really, it's kind of an obscure part of psychology. And I think it's more interesting as historically because it inspired so many people, and it feeds the argument. If you want to argue, no, psychology is a science, you could point to Weber's law and say, look, here's a quantitative law correlating, not just correlating, but mapping, like mathematically mapping physical stuff to mental stuff. Gustav Fechner came along later, and he really systematized Weber's stuff. He kind of popularized it and added to it a lot, made it more sophisticated. In a way, Weber was kind of too modest to ever kind of take off, so sometimes you need someone like Fechner to come afterwards, and Fechner was a little bit more rigorous with the mathematical proofs, and he promoted it better. Fechner is a very interesting guy. He believed some very bizarre stuff. He went blind from staring at the sun at one point and made a deal with God. If you give me my sight back, I'll dedicate my life to glorifying you. He had a very interesting life. But for the purposes of this class, the least you need to know is that Fechner was a psychophysicist who came in after Weber started psychophysics, and Fechner kind of spruced it up, popularized it, and really added to it. Also notice that Fechner was a physician. A lot of these people, you'll see a trend. A lot of them were physiologists, physicians, doctors, stuff like that. Now, a lot of people will say that psychology doesn't really have an Isaac Newton or like a founding father of psychology. And if you had to debate whether there's a founding father of psychology or someone who's like the Isaac Newton of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt would have to be on that list. And I'm going to argue throughout this module that he's the guy. By any reasonable criteria, Wilhelm Wundt is the guy who really got psychology as a science started. So Wundt, he was operating in the late 1800s. That's not his birth These aren't his birth dates. These are just when he was active. He published a textbook in experimental psychology called Principles of Physiological Psychology. This was in 1874. This was the first ever textbook on psychology, not as a philosophy, not as a subdiscipline of philosophy, but as a experimental psychology, an empirical science. You know, he used the word physiological in it. To him, that basically meant experimental. He created the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig. A psychology laboratory is what it sounds like. It's where you gather empirical data on psychology systematically. You have a premises, room, devices for people to systematically in an organized fashion gather data. So people had gathered empirical data before Wundt. They gathered empirical data systematically to some extent, and but Wundt was the first person to have he was at a university and had a dedicated set of offices and facilities to systematically conduct psychological research, empirical psychological research. Most of his research had to do with what you'd call immediate experience, like a sense of time, perception, attention. And so it's kind of like an extension of psychophysics, right? Psychophysics was about perception, just noticeable differences, 2-point thresholds. Wundt's work was pretty closely related to this. He was ultimately interested in every facet of the mind, not just this kind of low-level perceptual stuff, but he believed the tools of experimental, kind of physiologically inspired experimental psychology was it was a good fit for studying this kind of stuff. But he was also interested in how creativity, strategizing, problem solving, the kind of like grander, more high level stuff that people are capable of doing. But obviously, even today, it seems like a stretch to use the same methods we use to study perception and attention to study this stuff. But Wundt was equally interested in all of these, and Wundt did collect empirical data. This was like timing. How long does it take them to discriminate between two stimuli? How accurately can people perform certain tasks? Like with psychophysics, you're looking at when can someone see that there's a difference? When do they fail to see that there's a difference between stimuli? So this was legitimate, empirical. There's a laboratory going on, etc. I want to emphasize that because that's going to be relevant later. Also, something I want to stop and remark on is that Wundt created the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig. Some people, I think, that have a pro-America bias maybe, say that William James technically had the first psychology laboratory. However, when we talk about William James, you'll see that he actually didn't do too much empirical research. And James's laboratory, I think it was at Harvard, was actually not meant to do research. It was more to do demonstrations. Like he would show people neat stuff. It was more like an exhibit than a place to do research. Another important function of someone, if you're going to be credited as one of the founders of a discipline, is if you created the first academic journal. And Wundt did that. He founded the journal Philosophical Studies, later changed to Psychological Studies because we want to be taken seriously. This is empiricism, empirical data. Thank you very much. His psychology lab was hugely popular, grew in size. If you go down the list of all the earliest scientists, psychological scientists, G. Stanley Hall, Titchener, anytime you read about the early history of psychology, you will frequently see the words studied under Wundt in Leipzig. Wundt mentored basically all or nearly all of the most famous, influential people in the field. Yeah. So this stuff about introspection, this is going to become a big sticking point later. What did Wundt mean by introspection? He meant methods that show what you can and can't see or how fast. It's proxies to your mental life, like just noticeable differences, 2 point thresholds. You tell me these weights seem to be the same or these light levels seem to be different. That's what introspection is. The things are very closely, highly correlated to your mental life. He did not mean sitting down and saying, this is what my experiences are like. He had something very specific in mind. You know, you press a button and we document when you pressed it relative to when the stimulus was shown. It's actually introspection, the way Wundt meant it, is pretty objective, not very subjective like most people would think introspection meant. Probably should have done this in a different order, but these are largely arranged chronologically. Wundt was a big fan of Donders. Donders worked before Wundt for the most part, but they actually overlapped quite a bit. Donders developed this thing called the method of subtraction. Now, if you're looking at all this early empirical psychological research, you see a lot of reaction times, you see a lot of, yes, I can tell the difference between these stimuli, no, I can't tell the difference between these stimuli. Donders created this method for detecting how long different stages of a mental event takes. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you want to measure how long does it take someone to discriminate that a stimulus is from one category or a different category. Let's say ultimately I want to know how long does it take someone to say this is a red light, not a green light. If you want to know that, you have to use Donders' subtraction method. To use the subtraction method, you have to look at all the stages involved. I am shown the stimulus, I perceive the stimulus, I decide whether it's a red light or a green light, and then I press the button, okay? Those are a bunch of stages that happen one after another. It's a chain reaction. You want to know how long a specific stage within that chain of stages happens, you got to start breaking them down. So first, you want to know how long does it take just to press a button when you see the stimulus. So I'm just going to show you just red lights, and as soon as you see a light, you press the button. Let's say that takes you an average of 100 milliseconds. That means it takes you about 100 milliseconds to perceive the light and press the button. That's this timeline. It's 100 seconds total. Now, let's add one complication. I'm not just going to show you red lights. When I do show you red lights, you press the button, but I'm also going to flash some green lights at you. Don't press the button when I show you green lights. How long does it take you to press the button? Well, let's say it takes you 150 milliseconds. That means you perceive the stimulus, you decide whether it's red or green, and then you press the button. So it's like this first chain of events, but just one extra stage is added. You compare, this is just button pressing and perception. This is button pressing and perception and discriminating between stimuli. Is it a red light or a green light? All you gotta do is subtract. You take the 3 stages together minus the 2 stages. The 2 stages is just perceive the stimulus, press the button. 3 stages is you see the stimulus, you press the button, but you also have to determine whether it's red or green. And you get, voila, 50 milliseconds. 50 milliseconds is how long it takes you to decide whether a stimulus belongs to one category or another. This is the kind of empirical, I'd say pretty damn objective research that Wundt was doing. And Donders, his method of subtraction, I should have a slide about this. His method of subtraction was the main way that people analyzed brain data when we eventually got the technology to do it. You would have people do tasks like these, but you'd have them lie in an fMRI scanner so that later we can look at their brain activation, Look at their average brain activation when they're doing just these two processing stages, and then subtract that from the brain activation from when they're doing these three processing stages, and you can see, okay, uh, anytime you look at a stimulus, the occipital lobe is going to be activated. That's basic perceptual processing. Uh, Parts of the motor areas, that's kind of between your frontal lobes and parietal lobes. So like if you put on some headphones, the part of the top, you nudge them forward just a little bit. Those are your motor areas. Those are going to light up anytime that you're trying to coordinate a motor action like pressing a button. So you get recordings of that. You see stimulus, you press button. But then you have people do the bigger task. So you're going to have occipital lobe for seeing the stimulus. You're going to have motor strip activation for pressing the button, just like before. But then you're going to be categorizing stimuli. You might see ventral temporal lobe activation, or you might see some frontal lobe activation. I don't really remember which part does what, which part would probably do what. But this is an important methodology. You know, in Wundt's time, it was just to find out how long does each stage take. But later, we co-opted this and said, well, which parts of the brain do which parts of the task? So it ended up being very relevant all around. Another very important figure from this time period, also a European, was Hermann Ebbinghaus. Not much is known about him aside from his the years that he was active. And yeah, he did some very interesting early rigorous research. It's kind of odd, but it was rigorous and we have replicated it. What Ebbinghaus would do is he would use himself as his only research subject. That wouldn't fly today, but back in the day, that was, you know, you got to start somewhere. And what he would do is he would measure different aspects of his memory, and he would do so by writing out a bunch of note cards, and he would write these trigrams, these series of, it's consonant, vowel, consonant, like T-A-D or D-A-T or D-I-T. And he would memorize series of trigrams like these. And he would see, for instance, let's say I want to measure a deck of these trigrams. I draw 20 at random. Let's say I memorize all 20. I can recite all 20 in order. Now, if I come back an hour later, 10 minutes later, a week later, how many do I remember? And he precisely measured how memory decays and recovers and behaves over time in a very rigorous and mathematical kind of way, which we actually still haven't even really, some people are still doing stuff like this, but this was really impressive research, especially early on. So here's Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. If you studied a deck of his trigrams and got yourself to 100%, and then you tested your memory not too long after, let's say like this is the 1 day mark, you study it 12 hours later, 6 hours later, within the first 6 hours, within the first few hours, well actually this says 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 hour, that doesn't look right. If this is 1 day, why would this be 1 hour? I don't know. Basically, what he found is that we, at first, forget all the information very rapidly. There's a very steep forgetting curve. But we do retain, we'll ultimately retain about a quarter of the information. It's just that we rapidly forget the first 3/4 of that information and sort of asymptotically approach the 25%. So we do ultimately remember like about a quarter of the stuff that we encounter, but within the first hour or so, we forget most of it. Very interesting stuff and highly relevant to studying. Whenever you are in class learning this stuff, you know it 100%. We don't always necessarily realize that we're also forgetting it all very quickly. We're going to remember about a quarter of it, but Just one day after the lecture, if I give you a pop quiz, you're probably only going to remember a little over a quarter of the information that I tested you on. And in fact, now this won't be on a quiz or anything, there's this thing called the delayed judgment of learning effect, and or delayed JOL effect. And that finding is basically when you teach someone something and ask them how well will you remember it later, they're very inaccurate in judging how well they'll actually retain the information. Instead, if you ask people not when they just learned it, but ask them later, you say, hey, if I gave you a test on this later, how much of it will you remember? Now, all of a sudden, people are a lot more accurate. It's as if we somehow don't realize how much we forget. Well, we're constantly forgetting stuff, but we don't seem to incorporate that into our judgments of how well we learn things. We based how well we learn things based on just how we feel in the moment. So keep in mind, if you just learn something in a class, you're going to forget a lot of it, so you need to remind yourself. You need to study. Speaking of studying, here's this thing called the retention curve. And basically, the more you relearn information, the more it sticks around. So if you study one of Ebbinghaus's decks of trigrams, get yourself up to 100%, and you wait one day, you might get down to 80%. You study it all again, get yourself back up to 100%, and then you remember it all a lot better. It takes a lot longer to get back down to 80% forgetting. Ebbinghaus did these experiments over and over and over and over again and found that when you relearn things, you still keep forgetting them, but you retain them a lot better. The curves become less steep. So I would say if you're going to be studying for an exam, it's a lot better to just come and study a little bit every day, maybe a couple of times a day. Even if it doesn't feel like you're doing much, you're keeping the information. The more you relearn it, it's going to stick around a lot better. It's a whole lot better than cramming, I could tell you that. All right. I'm kind of tempted to do a part 2 again, but I think I'm going to stick through it. So another big argument you can make about psychology being a legitimate science is the existence of psychometrics. A lot of people, Galileo, Kant, said that psychology isn't possible because the mind can't observe itself, which I guess in the sense that they meant it is true. But there's a lot of psychological phenomena that we can measure. If you look back at the psychophysicists, they're asking you, do these weights seem to be about the same or do they seem to be different? When you notice that a light is showing, you click the button. Or if you notice there's a light showing, click the button if it's red, don't click the button if it's green. There's ways of being as objective as possible and measuring real, relevant psychological phenomena, even if you're not measuring something directly, right? With the Donder's subtraction method, I'm not directly observing your brain making the distinction between green light versus red light, but by observing your behaviors carefully, I'm measuring and observing these very close approximations that are highly correlated with the thing that I am trying to study. And psychometrics is basically taking that idea and running with it. We want to study things like personality and intelligence, depression, how depressed are you? We want to be able to diagnose people with disorders. You can't measure these things directly, so yeah, you can't stick a meat thermometer in someone's head and get this reading that tells you exactly how intelligent they are or exactly how ADHD they are. But through rigorous research and testing, you can create measures and instruments that can provide you with useful numbers and measurements, and therefore you can correlate them with other numbers. You have variables, you can have laws, you can have science, all of that. So if you're going to study the history of psychometrics, that's all going to start with Francis Galton. That's this very unusual looking guy right here with the sideburns and not much sideburns, eyebrows, and not much else. A little bit of back hair right here. Galton was a very interesting guy. He was cousins of Charles Darwin. He never finished his formal education, but like many wealthy people in this period of time in Europe, it was kind of being a learned man was just kind of seen as a very desirable trait. So, Galton was wide read. I think he went on some expeditions. He went and dug up fossils. He did all kinds of stuff. So while he didn't finish college, he kind of kept educating himself. He was very interested in intelligence, um, a little obsessed, you might say. That was kind of the main thing he studied. He believed that intelligence ran in families. He would go and he would study, ask yourself, is this how you verify a theory? Is this, falsifiable? What would Galton do? He would go and find families that he considered to be eminent, highly successful families. Is that what it means to be intelligent, to be successful? Not really. But if you are intelligent, you must be successful, right? This was Darwin. Darwin just came out. Evolution, survival of the fittest was it was a very influential idea. Well, Galton noticed that all the wealthy, successful people had wealthy, successful kids. Must be genetic. Hopefully, a lot of you at home are cringing at this idea because it's kind of the most ignorant, backwards, kind of harebrained take you could possibly have. Yeah, wealthy families, successful families have successful kids because they, it's not genetic. It's the financial resources. It's the connections. You send your kids to a good school. You and your friends, you're the successful elite in the city, so you get your kids the internships. Yeah, it's crazy. As crazy as it is, this started the eugenics movement. If you don't know what eugenics is, it was a very influential idea. There's this idea that some people are just inherently better than other people. They're more adapted to their environment. They're smarter. They have better self-control. They are good, upstanding, moral people. And if you want the human race to thrive and flourish, you got to make sure that the best people breed and that the not so great people, criminals, people with mental disorders, people that are developmentally delayed or have a mental impairment, um, you know, maybe they shouldn't breed. Maybe they should be sterilized. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to marry. At the time, this seemed like a no-brainer, right? You want all the good genes to get passed along and all the bad genes to not get passed along. Hopefully you at home are cringing at this because this is a terrible way of looking at things. And of course, they are confounding success with intelligence, which is not the same thing at all. Success and money is not genetic. But these people were only just starting to think about this stuff. Galton started doing lots of intelligence tests, and that was a big pastime, was to go get your intelligence tested and measured. And what's odd about these tests is there's a sense in which Galton and people like Galton kind of just assumed that everything is related to everything else. How good you are at seeing, how strong you are, your hand-eye coordination, this is all the general just good adaptiveness. Hopefully you see that they're not really working hard to dissociate things that can be dissociated. They're kind of just using this Darwinian general fitness idea. If you're fit, that means you're fit. It doesn't mean it. They don't go and look at fine-grained details of what does it mean to be fit. Is there different facets of being fit? He also discovered correlation and regression to the mean. So if you ever took Psych 2525 at LSUA, you have Galton to thank for some of that material. And here's a nice little meme I found that kind of conveys some of my outrage at Galton and the eugenics movement. They were basically praising the role of genetics in people's success, but, unequal access to opportunities and parental wealth was really what was doing all the hard work, but genetics just took all the credit. Kind of summarizes what I was going for with all that. Anyway, I arranged all this stuff chronological. I might change that as I teach this more, but I like going chronological, even if we're kind of jumping from topic to topic and jump from one topic back to another and back again. But let me talk to you about Edward Titchener. Titchener was British. He went to Leipzig to study under Wundt, and then he got a job at Cornell in America. And when he got to Cornell, he was everyone's source of information on Wundt's ideas. And he told people Wundt was this thing called a structuralist, and Wundt studied consciousness. Wundt had people sit down and analyze their own conscious experiences using introspection. Titchener said introspection is where you analyze the basic elements of your perceptions. You remember John Locke, the empiricist? They said that your perceptual categories like red and small and ball is an abstraction from perceptions you've had in the past. You've seen small things before, you've seen red things before, you've seen balls before. You take all these combinations of features and you eventually abstract the general concepts. Now, Titchener said what we need to do, he said, what Wundt does is you sit down and you try to figure out what these elements are. Your perceptions are these molecular combinations of basic elements, and we want to discover the basic elements. If you rewind, you'll notice that this is not at all what Wundt was talking about. I don't know what Titchener was smoking, but Titchener basically went to America, told everyone that Wundt was doing something that Wundt was not doing, and for years, people would not give Wundt the credit that he deserved. I have read modern psychology textbooks, history of psychology textbooks sometimes. It's one thing if it's an introduction to psychology. It's another thing if it's an introduction to cognitive or experimental psychology. But I've read history of psychology books that give Titchener's definition of Wundt and structuralism as if that's what was going on. That's not what was going on. Wundt was doing real, rigorous, empirical scientific research. Titchener was not. Sorry if I'm getting a little flustered, but it's crazy to me that this goes on. This is basically reiterating what I just said to some extent. Titchener was appropriating the phrase structuralism and Wundt's. Wundt was a big name, but Wundt wrote in German, and not everyone had access to translations of Wundt's work or read German. So you kind of had to take Titchener's word for it. What Titchener would do is he would have people sit down and he would teach you to, okay, I want you to analyze your perceptions. Don't tell me what you're seeing, like that's an apple. I want you to say there's a red, bulbous shape in the center of my visual scene. You got to break it down to the basic elements. Because Titchener wanted to figure out what the basic elements were. And when you did it wrong and you didn't tell him the right elements he wanted to hear, he would train you to give you the correct elements that he was trying to discover. So he was teaching you to tell him the thing he was trying to discover. I don't like Titchener. I don't know if you can tell, but I just think this guy is a giant goofball. And that's the nice way of saying it. Let's talk about something I like a lot better. William James. William James was he founded his own school in America at Harvard. He was really a philosopher, but he did a lot of psychology. A lot of people can't really decide, was he a philosopher or was he a psychologist? But he founded this school of functionalism. Um, and according to functionalism, we as organisms have a mind and the mind has a purpose. Every facet of the mind, attention, memory, perception, is part of the structure of the mind for a reason. It is adapted to help us in some way. What was his methodology for getting down into the nitty-gritty details of working on his theory or discovering new things about the mind? Well, James was not really an experimentalist. He did collect some empirical data. Apparently, I just read about this the other day. He actually did do some work on like the inner ear and how that affects balance. James was he was trained as a physician at some point, but all these people have crazy lives. James had a mental breakdown at some point and decided to be a philosopher instead of a doctor. He actually tried out all kinds of different professions. But mostly, the way James would do his work is he would kind of think about how his own mind seemed to work, and he would describe it and base his theories on that. So he's not really doing what Wundt and Wundt's followers over in Europe are doing. But he did know his physiology, and someone who's well-read in the latest physiology and someone who's really good at examining their own mind can say some useful things about what they think is going on with the mind and the brain and whatnot. One theory that James is credited with, and this wasn't based on empirical evidence, but based on just what he knows about physiology and his own examination of his own feelings. That's what introspection is. He came up with this theory of emotion that is now called the James Lange theory of emotion. And it's basically the idea that our physiological reactions that we associate with emotions actually come first. Our interpretation of those physiological reactions come later. So he liked to use the example of, let's say you're walking through the woods and you suddenly encounter a grizzly bear. Your heart starts pounding, you start to have adrenaline, you feel like you can't think too straight. That's the physiological reaction to seeing the grizzly bear. But also imagine running into someone you have an intense head over heels crush on. Your heart speeds up, you feel some adrenaline, you feel like you can't think as straight before. James says that our body reacts physiologically to certain stimuli for certain reasons. We're adapted to react in certain ways. And what emotions really are is our interpretation of these physiological signals. Our body doesn't know if we're in love or if we're seeing a grizzly bear. We have to interpret those things after the fact. The emotions don't have any content until we've interpreted them. And getting a little, not really off topic, but outside of class material, you won't see this on a test, but there are these interesting studies where they'll have people misinterpret their physiological signals in kind of entertaining ways. So for instance, if you have subjects in your psychology experiment go on a blind date, you have some people in a control group go and do something like go see dinner and a movie. You measure some physiological signs like their heart rate, their pulse, the certain skin conductance, electrical reactivity, which is a measure of your arousal, stuff like that. You have people go on a pretty standard date, and you ask them how attracted you were to your date. Are you interested in dating them again? And you find that people have their different levels of arousal and physiological reaction, and they have their levels of attraction. That's the control group. For an experimental group, you instead have people do various tasks that are going to produce arousal, like zip lining or They go for a hike, and there's part of the hike where you have to go across this rickety bridge where you're not really sure if it's going to hold up. You put people in situations where they're going to be a little excited, get a little bit of adrenaline. And what they find in this study, or studies like these, is that people end up getting physiologically aroused and excited, and they end up being more attracted to their date and have a greater intention of going on a second date. And in fact, they're more interested in their partner and the date to the extent that they were more physiologically responding to the situation. So this fits with James's theory of emotion, that the physiology comes first, and what we call emotions is really just the interpretation of this stuff that comes after the fact. I need to take a drink. All right. Another reason James is so important to the history of psychology is because he wrote this 2-volume book called The Principles of Psychology. And this was the textbook for a long time, went through several editions. If you got a psychology degree, you read this book. This book was on your shelf. You've probably read it many times. Classes based off of certain chapters. It was the book. And it actually still holds up today. If you read William James's Principles of Psychology, there's sections on biology, there's sections on like memory, there's sections on learning. It holds up as a psychology book. A lot of what it says is still true. It's missing some of the new stuff we've encountered, but it's very well written and holds up. So yeah, I think this stuff about functionalists versus structuralists is it's an interesting historical question, how incompatible they really were. Intellectually, where did their theories actually clash? The people associated with James and functionalism in the United States certainly had some beef with the structuralists, quote unquote, in the States. Titchener, they didn't respect Titchener's way of doing things, and I guess some people in the States believed that that's what was going on in Europe, which is kind of funny because that's not what was going on in Europe. But, people clashed on things like that. Another idea that James had, and I put this little GIF in here to kind of make fun of it, but I've actually softened up on this a little bit. James also believed in something called pragmatism. Pragmatism is this idea that, look, if you're not sure if a certain idea is true or not, ask yourself, is there any way to show evidence for or against it? If the answer is no, ask yourself this. If you believing this would help you and not hurt anyone, yes, well then why not just believe it? If it's useful to you, if you have a better life because you believe it and it's not hurting anyone, and there's just no way of proving it either way, just believe it. This was important to James because he struggled at some point in his life with questions about free will. He studied physiology, and he kind of thought, what if I'm just a meat machine and I have no control over my life? He struggled with his beliefs in religion and God. And one day he said, you know what? I've read the debates about free will versus determinism. I've read the debates about God's existence. I think they're stalemates. And if I believe in free will and if I believe in God, I know that's going to get me out of bed in the morning. That's going to get me excited for life again. That's going to make me feel exuberant again. And it's not going to hurt anyone. Me believing in free will is not going to harm anyone. Me believing in God isn't going to harm anyone. It's not like James was part of the Westboro Baptist Church going and protesting soldiers' funerals and stuff. People have different ways of turning their belief in God into practice. James said if you're not going to harm anyone and there can't be any real decisive evidence for or against, let's be pragmatic. Just believe it if it's going to help you. I've softened on this idea. I used to not like the idea. I used to think, if you can't prove it either which way, then you don't have to believe. You can just reserve judgment. But I've softened on this, and if you're going to be a therapist or a counselor, you are probably going to be a pragmatist in some sense, because a lot of your clients are going to need to have ways of thinking about the world, better habits of seeing things, ways of interpreting things that might be very adaptive for them and might help them in their life. And maybe it's not so useful or helpful to stop and say, but wait, we don't know if that's true or not, though. Sometimes it's better just to think about, what's more adaptive for you. Here's another way to cash out this idea of pragmatism. I once had a student come and visit me in my office hours, and in a roundabout way, in so many words, he said, I don't believe humans are really altruistic. I don't think humans are capable of being truly altruistic. That means being kind and selfless to others with absolutely no benefit to yourself. I don't really have a strong opinion either way, but, I played devil's advocate and I named a bunch of examples of, what if someone gives to charity? And, the student said, well, that makes people feel good. It makes them feel like they're a good person. They get off on that. Okay, what if someone volunteers their time? Same thing. What about all the sacrifices parents make for their kids? Kids, that's part of your genetic line, and you eventually want to have these successful kids so you can feel like you've accomplished something. It's all about you. It's never about others. What about Mother Teresa? This didn't actually come up, but I have heard people say, look, hey, the people like Mother Teresa, they're just trying to really secure their spot in heaven. That's what it's really all about. Dedicating your whole life to helping others and living in poverty, whatever Mother Teresa did or didn't do. I'm not a Mother Teresa expert. Someone could spin that and say, well, it's actually selfish. It's not altruistic because, she's just in it for herself at the end of the day. According to a strong pragmatist, a pragmatic way of looking at this is saying, hey, if this concept makes no difference in your life, then you don't have to use the concept. Maybe you shouldn't use it. And let's also consider, if you believe people are incapable of being altruistic, what is that belief going to mean for you in your life? Is it going to make you depressed, cynical? Maybe you shouldn't believe it. If there's no way of deciding whether people are altruistic or not by examining empirical evidence and believing that people can be altruistic has some positive use for you and it's not going to harm anyone if you believe it, then you can look at it not as a matter of whether it's true or false, but a matter of whether it's a useful belief to believe or not. It's a very different way of looking at things if you're used to being more of a science kind of guy. Fun fact, in 1909, there was this big all-star psychology conference at Clark University. Some of the biggest names in the history of psychology were there, including William James and Sigmund Freud. We haven't met Sigmund Freud yet. But when I read about this, I was so awestruck that two such big, giant pillars of psychology were right next to each other in the same, one, Freud's from Austria, James is from America, and they just happen to both be at the same conference. What's interesting also is apparently James didn't like Freud very much. He said, Freud was a man obsessed with fixed ideas. I can make nothing in my own case with his dream theories, and obviously symbolism is the most dangerous method. I agree, James. I agree. All right. I think I can make it through these last couple of slides, although I am starting to dry up. How long have I been talking? All right, let's try to finish this. So, going back to the psychometrics, the psychometricians. Remember, I'm doing this all chronologically rather than topically, for better or for worse. There was this guy, Alfred Binet, and the French government wanted him to come up with some way of deciding whether certain school children needed additional help and whether other school children are good to go forward with the normal, typical education. So Binet developed what would eventually become the modern IQ test. And what's interesting is a lot of people, including myself, feel that IQ tests have an undeserved level of respect in our culture and that they don't really measure what a lot of people think they're measuring. And when you go back and look at its origins, the IQ test in the beginning was just a tool for making decisions. It was not claiming to measure some abstract thing called intelligence. It was just a way of helping you make a decision. Should this child be held back a grade? Should this child go to a different classroom that's smaller and has an instructor that's trained in special education? Something along those lines. But psychometrics grew as a field in terms of testing mental abilities and personality traits and whatnot. Spearman was an important point in the timeline here. He pioneered what we now call factor analysis. Factor analysis, if you don't know, is a means of looking at how a bunch of variables ultimately relate to one single thing. So an intelligence test, you might measure like how many words starting with a G can you name in 1 minute, and you measure how many words they can think of. Or I'm going to give you a sequence of 10 numbers, and then I want you to recall them back to me in reverse order and add 3 to each one. So you measure how accurate they are in doing that and how long it takes them to do that. You ask them to pay attention and memorize something while they're being distracted. You do all these tasks that are not all that similar to each other, but are all ultimately supposed to be related to general intelligence. Factor analysis is a way of looking at all these variables and specifying to what degree are they related to some general construct, some general trait, or some general skill. Remember eugenics? Eugenics and psychometrics unfortunately went hand in hand as IQ tests started developing into a more general tool, not just for deciding whether some children need special schooling or not, but was also a way of morally judging whether you deserve to breed or not. Goddard played a role in this. He, like many people in the eugenics, well, you have to believe this if you're a eugenicist, they believe that intelligence was inherited. Low intelligence was his main culprit for crime and all of societal ills like gambling and pornography and all those terrible things. It's all because some people are less intelligent. By the way, that's not what causes crime, in case that needs to be said. But yeah, Goddard was a eugenicist, so he believed that some people are more worthy of breeding than others. Some eugenicists would say, let's find the spectacular, intelligent people. And intelligence here, remember the Galton slides, is kind of an ill-defined, broad concept that really just means general fitness. It doesn't really mean intelligence. They're kind of vague about that. But with IQ tests coming into their own, they're getting a little more specific. Other people like Goddard said, yeah, you go encourage the real good, fit, intelligent people to breed. I'm going to go track down the unintelligent, unfit people and discourage them from breeding. The United States embraced eugenics. Eugenics was embraced throughout the Western world, actually. Um, Certain people were legally barred from breeding, forcefully sterilized, barred from marrying, stuff like that. Goddard, he's famous for studying, he published this study on the Kallikak family. These are two families fathered by one man. One family was a side family. And this guy knocked up a barmaid, and that family lived in squalor. And this other family, this is the man's real wife, the proper lady. This is where the man actually stayed and was actually involved. His other family off on the side, he was less involved with. And can you believe it that one of these families fared better than the others and scored differently on IQ tests? It must mean because intelligence and general fitness is inherited. Because the barmaid was less intelligent than the proper lady. Boy, is it hard to. It's hard with the modern understanding that we have to look back at this and not just cringe. And hopefully, I'm speaking for everybody. Goddard would also help, or quote unquote, help the U.S. government decide which immigrants are allowed to stay or not, because low intelligence immigrants will destroy this country. So he would have his IQ tests translated very poorly into, Polish, Italian, etc. And a lot of people would fail these tests because they were not translated properly. So there was multiple choice questions where there was no right answer because the translation wasn't correct. So a lot of people were told to go back to where they came from because of Goddard's goddamn tests. Last slide, Yerkes. I'll keep it short and simple. Yerkes was a very prominent early psychologist. You ever heard of the Yerkes-Dodson law? If you haven't, look it up. It's neat. But that's just one of the famous things he was involved with. In the context of psychometrics, Yerkes tried to really legitimize psychology and advance psychology in a field by getting it involved in World War I and saying, look, we have this new psychological testing thing. We've been working on it for years. Let's use this to help you select which officers are worthy, like which recruits should be trained as officers, which officers should be promoted. It's a way of kind of helping. It's a way of basically doing HR with the Army. And many history of psychology textbooks kind of gloss over this, like this was a big win for psychology, but the Army terminated this program almost immediately. They brought it back eventually. I mean, if you've ever been recruited by an Army recruiter or had an Army people come and have you take a test or something, then you know this already. But at least back in Yerkes' time, the U.S. government did not consider it to be a success and terminated the program. So was it overall a success for psychometrics? I don't know. Maybe it was a step forward, but 2 steps back. Don't know. But that's it for today. Managed to do this all in one take and dry out my mouth. Have a good one.